At 0710 hours on June 4, 1942, the rising sun over Midway cast a golden shimmer across the runway at Eastern Island as Ensign Albert Ernest strapped himself into the cramped metal cockpit of a Grumman TBF Avenger. The aircraft smelled of hydraulic fluid, gun oil, and the unmistakable mix of adrenaline and fear that clung to every pilot preparing for what might be their final mission. Ernest, just 25 years old, from Richmond, Virginia, tightened his harness and glanced toward the horizon where the Japanese fleet waited. 6 combat missions behind him, 0 torpedo runs that had ever worked right, and now he was being asked to fly straight into the heart of the most powerful naval force on Earth with a weapon that failed 7 times out of 10. The odds didn't matter. Orders were orders, and the air was filled with the unmistakable tension of men who understood that this morning could very well be the last one they would ever see. Behind him in the turret sat Radioman 3rd Class Harry Fryer, barely 17, a kid who had joined the Navy straight out of high school in Springfield, Massachusetts. He checked the action on his .50 caliber machine gun with hands that trembled only slightly. Below them, crouched in the narrow belly compartment, Seaman 1st Class J. Manning from Seattle, 19 years old, braced himself and tested the swivel of the ventral gun. The 3 men had been flying together for barely 72 hours. But in combat, 72 hours could forge bonds stronger than a lifetime in peacetime. They were crew now, family now, and they were about to fling themselves toward 4 Japanese carriers, battleships, cruisers, and the entire striking force of the Imperial Navy steaming 180 miles to the northwest. The Avenger itself was brand new, the pride of American torpedo aviation. Twin-row radial engine, 2,000 horsepower, and capable of climbing to 300 miles per hour. On paper it was the most advanced torpedo bomber in the world. But Ernest knew better. Every pilot knew better. The aircraft wasn't the problem. The torpedo was. The Mark 13, an ungainly 2,200-pound beast, was notorious for failing, and today they would be dropping into a wall of flak and fighters with a weapon that barely functioned on its best day. Drop it too fast. It broke apart. Drop it too high. It shattered. Drop it perfectly. It might still run cold, sink, or veer wildly off course. Only 31% of them ever worked the way they were supposed to. The Bureau of Ordnance knew all this, had known it for years, but nothing had been done. The Newport Torpedo Station in Rhode Island had a monopoly on design, testing, and production. Protected by politics, funding, and tradition, they worked peacetime hours in wartime while pilots flew into death with broken tools. The engines roared to life, and 6 Avengers lifted off Eastern Island under the command of Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling. Within an hour, 5 of those 6 aircraft would be burning wrecks in the ocean. Ernest's plane would return riddled with 64 bullet holes, 9 20mm cannon hits, its turret gunner dead and the radio man bleeding. Every other crew, Fieberling, Braun, Gia, Lewis, Woodside, and their gunners, would die delivering torpedoes that wouldn't have exploded even if they had reached their targets. As Ernest limped back to Midway, his torpedo having fallen uselessly from the bomb bay after being damaged by Japanese fire, he didn't know if it would have worked. Deep down, he probably knew it would not have. The failures weren't the fault of courage. Every pilot at Midway flew with a level of bravery that defied reason. The problem lived inside the weapon itself. The Mark 13 was a technological relic, built in the 1920s for aircraft that flew at 80 miles per hour and dropped from 50 feet. In 1942, aircraft were 3 times faster, defenses were far deadlier, and yet the torpedo hadn't changed. When it hit water, essentially concrete at high speed, its fragile gyroscopes shattered, its depth mechanisms jammed, its propeller shafts bent. Its exploder, the infamous Mark 6, was so poorly designed that even perfect hits often resulted in nothing but a dull metallic thud and a torpedo sinking harmlessly beneath a target's keel. Pilots were dying not because they lacked skill, but because their weapons belonged to a different era. By mid-1942, torpedo bomber losses in the Pacific were catastrophic. At Midway alone, entire squadrons had been wiped out delivering weapons that simply did not function. At the Eastern Solomons, several Avengers were lost for a single light carrier, hit not by the explosive force of torpedoes but by Japanese damage control failures. At Santa Cruz, Lieutenant Commander John Collett led 12 Avengers in a perfect approach on the carrier Zuikaku. 2 torpedoes struck, their splashes visible across the waves, but neither detonated. Collett was shot down moments later. His gunner's final radio message echoed across the Pacific: "Torpedoes hit, but no explosion. Tell them the torpedoes don't work." He was 19. He never came home. The stories multiplied. Pilots saw torpedoes bounce off ships. Others watched them snake like drunken eels before sinking. Some saw warheads detach. In letters home, heavily censored, airmen poured out their frustration. Lieutenant Bruce Harwood wrote that they were being asked to do the impossible with equipment that seemed designed to betray them. By late 1942, the problem was no longer a secret among flyers. Every torpedo squadron knew that their weapons were defective. But duty was duty, and the missions continued. The turning point began not with the Navy but with a physicist. Dr. Charles Lauritsen of Caltech, brought in by the National Defense Research Committee, not the Bureau of Ordnance, was tasked with figuring out what was going wrong. He knew nothing about torpedoes, but he knew physics, and he knew how objects behaved when they hit water. So in early 1943, his team built a 300-foot test slide at Morris Dam northeast of Los Angeles, overlooking a tranquil mountain lake whose clear waters were perfect for high-speed filming. They dropped torpedoes, hundreds of them, filming every angle, measuring every oscillation, studying every failure the Navy had refused to acknowledge. What they discovered was devastating. Low, slow drops, the very method pilots had been ordered to use, caused the torpedo to belly flop, flexing its frame until internal components snapped. Slight nose-first impacts sent it plunging 50 feet underwater, far below any target's hull. Tail-first impacts destroyed the propellers. Only a narrow 20-degree entry window produced a workable run, and under combat conditions, it was nearly impossible to achieve. Lauritsen's team searched for solutions. They tried parachutes. They failed. They tried metal fins. Too heavy. Then someone suggested looking at what the Japanese had done at Pearl Harbor. Their torpedoes had been fitted with crude wooden box fins to stabilize them. American intelligence had dismissed them as primitive. But the Japanese had spent years refining them. If they worked, they worked. Lauritsen built wooden stabilizers. Better, but not enough. Then Caltech scientists designed a new device, an aluminum shroud ring shaped like an airfoil, bolted around the torpedo's tail. It stabilized the fall and reinforced the fins. Testing showed that torpedoes equipped with these shroud rings entered the water perfectly, almost every time. But they still hit the water too hard. So they added a second device, a large plywood ring around the nose. It looked absurd. Mechanics called it the pickle barrel, but it slowed the descent just enough to cushion the water impact. With both modifications, the torpedo became almost unrecognizable in flight, and utterly transformed in performance. Now it could be dropped from 800 feet at 260 knots. It entered the water cleanly, ran straight, and detonated on target. But the Navy refused to authorize it. So squadron mechanics took matters into their own hands. In backrooms, warehouses, and nighttime workshops on carriers, they drilled holes, bolted rings, wrapped plywood barrels around warheads, and quietly transformed the Mark 13 into a lethal weapon. The modifications spread through the fleet clandestinely, passed hand-to-hand in brown envelopes marked unofficial. Pilots whispered about them like forbidden magic, but they knew what they were doing. The proof came on June 19, 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. 8 Avengers from Task Force 58 attacked the Japanese carrier Hyo. 6 torpedoes ran perfectly. 3 hit. All 3 exploded. The carrier sank. The air crews didn't brag. They didn't tell the Bureau of Ordnance. They simply said the drops had been good. But aboard the carriers, pilots and mechanics knew the truth. This was the birth of the Mark 13 Mod 2A, the ringtail, the torpedo that finally worked. The next day, word spread like wildfire. Mechanics worked through the night, attaching shroud rings and pickle barrels to every torpedo aboard every ship. By dawn, the entire task force was equipped. And in the next day's strikes, 19 of 24 torpedoes ran true. American torpedo bombers, once flying coffins, now delivered death with cold precision. When Navy inspectors finally discovered the modifications, they demanded they be removed. Admiral Mark Mitcher overruled them. Combat results were undeniable. The modifications stayed. By late 1944, Japanese ships were being torn apart by the very torpedoes that had failed so miserably 2 years earlier. At Leyte Gulf, the super battleship Musashi absorbed 19 torpedo hits and countless bombs before finally rolling over. Yamato followed in April 1945. Japanese officers wrote stunned reports describing how American torpedoes, once unreliable, had become terrifyingly accurate and devastating. They examined wreckage, found the shroud rings and plywood barrels, and dismissed them as packaging material. They never realized that these simple, elegant modifications had changed the balance of naval warfare. What had once been a weapon pilots cursed had become one they trusted with their lives. And for men like Albert Ernest, who survived Midway with a dead gunner, a wounded radioman, and a torpedo that would never have worked, the transformation came too late. But the legacy of the men who flew those early missions, who died delivering broken weapons, lived on in every torpedo that finally ran hot, straight, and normal. Their sacrifice forced a reckoning, one that civilian scientists, rogue mechanics, and bold commanders turned into a revolution. In the end, the story of the Mark 13 torpedo isn't just about engineering failures or bureaucratic stubbornness. It's about the pilots who flew anyway, the mechanics who defied orders to save lives, the scientists who stepped outside their field to solve a problem others ignored, and the desperate necessity of war that sometimes forces innovation through courage rather than permission. By the final year of the Pacific War, American torpedo bombers had become everything the Navy had hoped they would be in 1942: deadly, precise, and feared. And it all began with a torpedo that didn't work, a physicist who thought it should, and a generation of young aviators who risked everything because they believed the mission mattered, even when their weapons did not.